The crystal champagne flute didn't shatter when she set it down, but the marriage did, right there in the middle of the crowded ballroom under the heavy chandeliers. It started with a whisper about him being difficult and ended with her storming out into the snowy night, leaving him drowning in public humiliation and confused guilt. But the real fracture didn't happen until the clock struck 12:01 a.m., when a single phone call from their son shattered the silence of an empty hotel room, proving that the noise of the party was nothing compared to the quiet violence of betrayal. If you find yourself drawn to the jagged edges of broken trust and the silence that speaks louder than words, stay with me. There are truths hidden in the dark that we are about to uncover together, and you won't want to look away. The word hung in the air between them, sharper than the winter chill rattling the windows of the grand ballroom. You are being difficult, Mark. Julianne said it with a smile, the kind that didn't reach her eyes but played perfectly to the onlookers. She adjusted the strap of her emerald gown, her movements fluid and practiced. To the vice president of marketing standing 3 feet away, it looked like a wife gently chiding a tired husband. To Mark, it felt like a scalpel sliding between his ribs. I just asked why you've been outside for 40 minutes, Mark said, keeping his voice low. He held his scotch glass a little too tightly. It's 10 degrees out there, Jules. I was taking a call. A crisis with the London account, she sighed, a tragic, weary sound. She reached out and patted his cheek. Her hand was ice cold. See? This is what I mean. You suffocate me. You get a few drinks in you, and you start counting my minutes. It's exhausting. Mark blinked, the gaslighting settling over him like a heavy coat. He hadn't finished his first drink. He wasn't counting minutes. He was worried. But looking around the gilded room of the Pierre Hotel, he saw the glances from their table. Poor Julianne. Dealing with him. I'm going home, she announced, loud enough for the couple next to them to hear. I have a migraine, and I don't have the energy to manage your mood tonight. I'll come with you, Mark said, instinctively moving to set his glass down. No. She stopped him with a hand on his chest. Don't. Please. I just need space. Stay here. Network. Try to enjoy yourself without making me the center of your universe for 1 hour. She turned and walked away. The emerald dress flowed behind her like water. Mark watched her go, feeling the familiar mix of shame and confusion. Had he been suffocating? Maybe he was. Maybe the stress of the firm was making him paranoid. He watched her disappear through the double doors, the crowd swallowing her whole. He didn't network. He couldn't. Instead, Mark retreated to the hotel bar downstairs, a dimly lit cavern of mahogany and leather, far away from the music and the judgment. He ordered a club soda and stared at his reflection in the mirror behind the bar. He looked tired. The gray at his temples seemed more pronounced tonight. Difficult. Was that who he had become? He checked his watch. 11:30 p.m. He sent a text. Hope you got home safe. I'm sorry if I was overbearing. No reply. Time stretched. The bar thinned out. The bartender began wiping down the counters. Mark sat in the silence, replaying the conversation, dissecting his own tone, wondering how a marriage that once felt like a fortress had turned into a minefield where every step triggered an explosion. 11:58 p.m., he should call an Uber, go home, sleep on the couch. 12 a.m., midnight. The day turned, 12:01 a.m. His phone buzzed against the polished wood of the bar. The screen lit up. It wasn't Julianne. Incoming call. Leo. Mark frowned. Leo was 12. He was supposed to be asleep hours ago. The babysitter, Mrs. Higgins, usually left once Julianne got home or stayed in the guest room if they were late. Mark swiped right, bringing the phone to his ear. "Leo? Everything okay, bud?" The silence on the other end was thick, trembling. "Dad?" Leo's voice was a whisper, small and terrified. "Dad, are you okay?" "I'm fine, Leo. I'm still at the hotel. Why are you awake?" There was a pause, a ragged intake of breath. "You're at the hotel?" "Yes. Mom just left a while ago. She should be there any minute if she's not already." "Dad," Leo's voice cracked. "If you're at the hotel, then who is downstairs screaming at Mom?" Mark went still. The ambient noise of the bar, the clinking glass, the low jazz faded into a dull hum. "What do you mean?" "I woke up because of the yelling," Leo whispered, and Mark could hear the muffled sound of a door being locked in the background. "It sounds like you, Dad. It sounds like you screaming at her to shut up." "But you're on the phone!" A cold dread, colder than the Chicago wind, gripped Mark's spine. "Leo," Mark said, his voice steady but his hand gripping the bar so hard his knuckles turned white. "Is Mom crying?" "Yes. And the man, he just threw something against the wall. Dad, what is happening?" Mark stood up, the chair screeching against the floor. "Lock your door, Leo. Get into the closet. Do not come out. I'm coming home." Mark hung up. He looked at the empty text thread with his wife. She wasn't home to sleep. She wasn't alone. And whoever was in his house playing his part in a violent play wasn't him. The drive from the hotel to the Gold Coast usually took 15 minutes. Mark made it in 9. His Mercedes tore through the slush of Michigan Avenue, the tires fighting for grip on the black ice. The city was a blur of sodium vapor orange and charcoal gray, but Mark saw none of it. All he could see was the image of his 12-year-old son huddled in a closet, pressing a phone to his ear. All he could hear was the phantom sound of his own voice, screaming that Leo had described. "It sounds like you, Dad." Mark gripped the steering wheel until his leather gloves creaked. The heater blasted dry, hot air against his face, but a cold sweat pricked at his hairline. If someone was in the house impersonating him, shouting at Julianne, then Julianne was in danger, or she was the director of the play. The thought arrived unbidden, sharp, and poisonous. He tried to push it away. He thought of Julianne's face at the party, the cool, practiced disappointment. "You are being difficult." Was this the punishment? A staged break-in to terrify him into compliance? But to involve Leo? That was a line she wouldn't cross. Surely she wouldn't cross that. He skidded to a halt in their driveway. The house stood imposing and dark against the winter sky, a fortress of brick and limestone. No police lights, no shattered windows, just the heavy, oppressive silence of a wealthy neighborhood at midnight. Mark didn't bother with the garage. He killed the engine and ran to the front door, his keys jangling violently in his shaking hand. He jammed the key into the lock. It turned smoothly, unlocked. He pushed the door open, bracing himself for chaos, for the smell of gunpowder, for the sound of weeping, for a stranger lunging from the shadows. "Julianne!" he shouted, his voice cracking. "Leo!" Silence answered him. The foyer was pristine. The marble floor gleamed under the faint light of the street lamps filtering through the transom window. His coat, the one he had worn yesterday, hung undisturbed on the rack. The air didn't smell like violence. It smelled of lavender reed diffusers and the faint, metallic tang of the radiator. He took the stairs 2 at a time, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He reached the landing and sprinted to the master bedroom. He threw the door open. "Julianne?" The room was dark, illuminated only by the soft blue glow of a humidifier. In the center of the king-sized bed, a mound of blankets shifted. Julianne sat up slowly, shielding her eyes against the hallway light. She wore her silk sleeping mask, pushed up onto her forehead, and her hair was tousled. "Mark?" Her voice was thick with sleep, scratchy and confused. "What? What are you doing? Is it morning?" Mark stood in the doorway, chest heaving, adrenaline crashing into a wall of confusion. She wasn't crying. She wasn't bleeding. There was no man. "Leo called me," Mark gasped, stepping into the room, scanning the corners for a shadow, a movement, anything. "He called me at 12:01. He said there was screaming. He said a man was screaming at you downstairs." Julianne blinked, reaching for the carafe of water on the nightstand. She looked at him with a mix of pity and irritation, the same look she had given him at the party. Screaming. She scoffed softly, pouring a glass. "Mark, look at you. You're hyperventilating. Nobody was screaming. I came home, took 2 Tylenol PMs and passed out. The house has been dead quiet for an hour." He was terrified, Jules. He was hiding in his closet. "He had a nightmare," she said flatly, taking a sip of water. "He's 12, but he still has an overactive imagination. And you're feeding it." "Did you drive here drunk?" "I am not drunk," Mark snapped, the accusation stinging. "He said he heard me. He said the man sounded like me." Julianne set the glass down. The sound was sharp in the quiet room. "That sounds like a guilt complex, Mark, not a break-in." She lay back down, pulling the duvet up to her chin, effectively dismissing him. "Go check on him if you must. Then go sleep in the guest room. You're manic, and I have a morning meeting." Mark stared at her for a long moment. Her breathing evened out almost instantly. She was too calm, too perfect. He turned and walked down the hall to Leo's room. The door was shut. He opened it gently. "Leo?" A small shape uncurled from the floor of the closet. Leo looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and wide, clutching his iPad to his chest. When he saw Mark, he didn't run to him. He hesitated. He looked at Mark's face, then at his hands, as if checking for blood. "Is he gone?" Leo whispered. "There was no one, buddy," Mark said, kneeling down, keeping his distance to not spook the boy. "Mom says she was sleeping. Maybe it was the wind, or a bad dream." Leo shook his head vehemently. "No, I heard it. The glass broke. I heard the glass break against the wall." "There is no broken glass, Leo. The house is clean." Leo stared at his father, a profound, adult sadness settling in his young eyes. He held out his hand. In his palm lay a single, jagged shard of crystal, thick, heavy, expensive. "I found this on the stairs before I hid," Leo whispered. "It fell off his shoe." Mark stared at the shard. It wasn't from their kitchen. It was distinctive. A piece of a heavy tumbler, smelling faintly of peat and oak. Mark took the shard. It was cold. "Stay here," Mark said, his voice dropping to a register he rarely used. "Lock the door again." He walked back out into the hallway. He didn't go to the guest room. He went back down the stairs, moving silently this time. He knelt on the bottom step, examining the carpet. There, almost invisible against the dark wool, was a damp depression. A footprint. Large, heavy tread. A man's winter boot. And next to it, a tiny melting bead of snow that hadn't evaporated yet. Julianne had been home for an hour. Her boots would be dry. Mark touched the wet spot. It was fresh. Someone had left the house moments before he walked in. Julianne wasn't sleeping. She was waiting. He stood up, the crystal shard cutting into his palm, the pain grounding him. She called him difficult. She called him paranoid. But the snow on the carpet didn't lie. The morning sun hit the marble island of the kitchen with a brightness that felt aggressive. It was 7 a.m. The house smelled of roasted coffee and expensive cleaners, the scent of a fresh start or a cover-up. Mark stood by the espresso machine, his hand in his pocket, fingers brushing the sharp edge of the crystal shard he had retrieved from Leo. He hadn't slept. He had spent the remaining hours of the night sitting in the guest room chair, listening to the silence of the house, waiting for a floorboard to creak. It never did. When he came downstairs at dawn, the wet footprint on the carpet was gone. The nap of the wool had been vacuumed into perfect, uniform lines. Coffee? Julianne walked into the kitchen. She was dressed for battle, or rather, for a Tuesday at the agency. A charcoal pencil skirt, a silk blouse, her hair pulled back in a severe, flawless chignon. She didn't look like a woman who had been screamed at by a phantom the night before. She looked like a CEO handling a liability. "I made your cup," she said, sliding a mug across the counter. Her tone was gentle, too gentle. It was the voice one used for an invalid or a volatile child. "How are you feeling this morning? Better?" Mark looked at the mug. "I wasn't sick, Julianne." "I know," she said soothingly, leaning against the counter and sipping her tea. "But you were agitated. The stress of the merger, the alcohol, it adds up. I texted Mark this morning to cancel dinner on Friday. I told him we need a quiet weekend to reset." Mark went cold. Mark was his law partner. "You texted Mark. What exactly did you say?" Julianne blinked, her expression the picture of innocent concern. "Just that things have been a little intense lately. That you're under a lot of pressure, and we need to focus on your health." He was very understanding. He said he noticed you seemed off at the office last week. Mark set his mug down. The porcelain clattered loudly against the granite. Julianne flinched, a small, theatrical recoil. "I am not off," Mark said, his voice low, fighting the urge to shout. "And stop rewriting last night. There was a man here. Leo heard him. I found a wet footprint. You vacuumed the hall this morning, didn't you?" Julianne sighed, setting her tea down with a precise click. She looked at him with a disappointment that felt rehearsed, as if she had practiced it in the mirror. "I vacuumed because the cleaning lady is sick today, Mark. And Leo," she lowered her voice. "Leo is confused because he heard you on the phone, frantic, telling him to hide in a closet. You scared him. You projected your paranoia onto a 12-year-old. I have the glass," Mark said, "the shard. From the tumbler you dropped in the garage last week?" Julianne shook her head. "Mark, please, I'm not fighting you. I'm trying to help you. Everyone is just worried." Everyone. His phone buzzed on the counter. A text from his sister, Sarah. "Jules told me about the gala. I know work is hard right now, but please take care of yourself. Don't push her away. We love you." Mark stared at the screen. The trap snapped shut in his mind with clarity. This wasn't just about an affair. This was a campaign. The comment at the party, "He's being difficult," wasn't an outburst. It was a press release. She had been seeding this narrative for weeks, maybe months. Mark is stressed. Mark is drinking. Mark is unstable. Now, any accusation he made about a man in the house would be viewed through the lens she had crafted, a paranoid delusion of a jealous, unraveling husband. "Where is Leo?" Mark asked, changing the subject. He needed to get out of this kitchen before he suffocated. I drove him to school early, Julianne said, checking her watch. He didn't want to see you. He's upset about the yelling. She picked up her briefcase. As she passed him, she paused, her hand hovering over his arm but not touching it. I love you, Mark, but I can't fix this for you. You have to want to get better. She walked out the back door, the heels of her boots clicking a steady, confident rhythm on the hardwood. Mark stood alone in the sun-drenched kitchen, the crystal shard in his pocket cutting into his thigh. She had turned his own son against him. She had turned his family against him. He pulled the shard out and held it up to the light. It was real. The jagged edge was sharp enough to draw blood. He wasn't crazy, but proving it was going to cost him everything she hadn't already stolen. The house had become a museum of silence. For 3 days, Mark moved through the rooms like a ghost in his own life, conscious of the way the air seemed to thicken whenever he entered a room. Julianne was perfectly pleasant, maintaining a terrifying consistency in her performance. She asked about his work. She arranged flowers in the foyer. She touched his shoulder with a pitying lightness that made his skin crawl. But it was Leo who haunted him. The boy had stopped speaking. He moved through the house with his head down, shoulders hunched, dragging his feet on the hardwood. Yesterday, the school nurse had called to say Leo had wet himself during math class, a regression that hadn't happened since he was 4. Julianne had taken the call with a heavy, performative sigh, shooting Mark a look that said, "Look at the damage you are causing." Mark found Leo in the solarium at the back of the house. The winter light was gray and flat, filtering through the glass walls. Leo was sitting on the floor, his back pressed against the cold radiator, his iPad glowing in his lap. He wasn't playing a game. He was just staring at the screen. "Hey, buddy," Mark said softly, stopping at the threshold. He didn't want to crowd him. Leo flinched but didn't look up. He was wearing his headphones, the large noise-canceling ones Mark had bought him for travel. Mark sat down on the ottoman a few feet away. "Mom's on a conference call in the study. I just wanted to see if you were hungry." Leo slowly pulled the headphones down around his neck. He looked exhausted. Dark circles bruised the skin under his eyes. He looked at the door to ensure they were alone, then looked at Mark. The fear in his eyes had morphed into something else, confusion mixed with a desperate need for validation. "I didn't dream it," Leo whispered. It was the first time he had spoken directly to Mark in 48 hours. "I know you didn't," Mark said, keeping his voice steady, anchoring himself to the truth. "I believe you, Leo. I found the footprint. I have the glass." Leo's lower lip trembled. He looked down at his iPad. His fingers hovered over the screen. "Mom said you were sick. She said you were confusing me. She made me delete the game I was playing that night because she said it was violent and gave me nightmares." "She made you delete it?" Mark asked, his pulse quickening. "Yeah, but..." Leo glanced at the door again. "She didn't know about the background app, the one you installed to monitor my screen time. It records audio triggers if the volume in the room goes over a certain decibel." Mark's breath hitched. He remembered. He had installed the parental control software 6 months ago, not to spy, but to make sure Leo wasn't gaming at 3 a.m. It had a safety feature, panic detection. Loud noises triggered a 30-second buffer recording. "Did it record?" Mark asked, the question barely audible. Leo nodded. He detached the iPad from its case and slid it across the Persian rug. "It's in the safety folder. I was scared to listen to it again. It sounds, it sounds like you, Dad, but it's not you. Mark picked up the device. His hands were shaking. He plugged his own earbuds into the jack to keep the sound contained. He navigated to the folder. File, alert, decibel, spike. 12:01:14 a.m. He pressed play. First, there was static, the muffled sound of the iPad being shoved under a pillow or into a closet. Then, the audio spiked. You selfish bitch. You think you can just walk away? Mark froze. The voice was uncanny. It had his cadence, his Chicago inflection, the deep timbre of his baritone. If he heard it in a crowded room, he might have turned his head thinking he had spoken. But it wasn't him. The pitch was slightly too high on the vowels. It was a mimicry, a performance. Then, a crash. The sound of crystal hitting plaster, and then, the voice again. But this time, it dropped the act. It shifted into a lower, smoother register, breathless with exertion or excitement. Was that loud enough for the cheap seats upstairs? And then, Julianne's voice. Not fearful, not crying. Perfect. Now get out. He's calling. The recording cut to static. Mark slowly took the earbuds out. The silence of the solarium rushed back in, but the world had tilted on its axis. It wasn't just an affair. It wasn't just gaslighting. It was a setup so precise, so malicious, that it bordered on sociopathic. Leo was watching him, tears standing in his eyes. Dad? Was it you? Mark looked at his son. He reached out and placed a firm hand on Leo's knee. No, Leo, that wasn't me, and you just saved us. From the hallway, the click of Julianne's heels echoed on the tile. She was coming. Take the iPad, Mark whispered, sliding it back. Hide it. Do not let her see it. Can you do that for me? Leo nodded, tucking the device under a cushion, just as Julianne appeared in the doorway. Her phone pressed to her ear, her smile bright and terrifyingly false. There you two are, she said, her eyes darting between them. Mark, your sister is on the line. She wants to know if you're seeing a therapist yet. Mark stood up, facing his wife. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. He had the weapon now. He just had to figure out how to fire it without destroying the hostage. The architecture of a lie, Mark realized, was not so different from the buildings he designed. It required a foundation, structural supports, and a facade to hide the load-bearing beams. Julianne had built a skyscraper of deceit, and the difficult husband narrative was just the scaffolding. He sat in the back booth of a diner on the outskirts of O'Hare, far from the Gold Coast social circles where Julianne's influence reigned. Across from him sat Vance, a private investigator who specialized in corporate espionage and high-asset divorces. Vance didn't look like a noir detective. He looked like a weary accountant with wire-rimmed glasses and a tablet in front of him. You're sure about the timestamp? Vance asked, tapping the screen. 12:01 a.m., last Tuesday, Mark said. He hadn't slept properly in a week, but his mind was razor-sharp. The fog of gaslighting had lifted. My son's iPad recorded it. I need a name, Vance. I need to know whose voice that is. Vance adjusted his glasses. The audio is clean enough. The guy has a distinctive cadence, mid-Atlantic accent, but with a slight lisp on the sibilants. He's projecting, acting. It's theatrical. Vance swiped on his tablet, bringing up a web of photos. I ran a cross-reference on your wife's professional circle. You said she's been pushing for a promotion to partner at the agency. Yes. She's been obsessed with it. She says she needs to show total dedication. Well, Vance turned the tablet around. She's certainly dedicated. Mark looked at the screen. It was a photo taken at a charity gala 3 months ago. Not the one where everything fell apart, but an earlier one. Julianne was laughing, her hand resting on the arm of a man in a tuxedo. He was younger than Mark, handsome in a sharp, predatory way, with the polished look of someone who sold ideas for a living. Lucas Sterling, Vance said. New creative director transferred from the New York office. He's her direct competition for the partner track theoretically. But practically. Vance tapped the screen again, pulling up a series of surveillance shots taken over the last 3 days. They showed Julianne and Lucas at a coffee shop in Lincoln Park. Not touching, not kissing, but leaning in, their heads close, conspiring. In one shot, Lucas was laughing, a wide, open-mouthed laugh that Mark could almost hear. He's not just her lover, Vance said quietly. He's her co-author. I ran a voice match against a podcast interview Sterling did last year. It's a 99% match to the guy screaming in your hallway. Mark stared at the face of the man who had terrified his son, Lucas Sterling. He had met him once, briefly, at a holiday mixer. Lucas had shaken his hand firmly, smiling with too many teeth, calling Mark the famous architect. Why? Mark asked, the question escaping him before he could stop it. Why the performance? Why scream at her if they are on the same side? Because of the prenup, Vance said, sliding a document across the table. I pulled the public records. Your prenuptial agreement has a fidelity clause, but it also has a spousal abuse and instability clause. If she cheats, she gets nothing. But if she leaves because she fears for her safety, if she can prove you are unstable, abusive, difficult, she bypasses the cap on the settlement. She gets half the firm, Mark, and full custody. The realization hit Mark like a physical blow. The staged fight, the fake screaming, the difficult comment in public. It wasn't just cruelty, it was a heist. They were staging a play where Mark was the villain, so they could rob him in broad daylight. The screaming wasn't a fight, Mark whispered, the cold anger settling in his chest. It was a rehearsal. They were creating a witness. My son. Exactly, Vance said, closing the tablet. They knew Leo was home. They counted on him hearing it. They weaponized your son's trauma to build her exit strategy. Mark stood up. He felt a dangerous calm wash over him. For days he had been playing defense, trying to prove he wasn't crazy. Now he knew the game. Send me everything, Mark said, throwing cash on the table. The photos, the voice analysis, the dates. What are you going to do? Vance asked, eyeing him carefully. If you confront them now, they'll spin it. They'll say you're stalking him. No, Mark said, buttoning his coat against the Chicago chill. I'm not going to confront them. I have a deposition next week. Julianne thinks she's walking into a slaughter. I'm going to make sure she's right. He walked out of the diner into the gray afternoon. His phone buzzed. It was Julianne. Can you pick up dinner on your way home? I'm exhausted. Long day dealing with difficult clients. Mark stared at the text. He typed back, his fingers steady. Of course. See you soon. He got into his car. He wasn't the difficult husband anymore. He was something much worse. He was the quiet one. The envelope landed on the kitchen island with a soft slap, sliding across the granite until it hit the fruit bowl. It was thick, creamy white, and stamped with the logo of a notoriously aggressive family law firm. I didn't want it to come to this, Mark, Julianne said. She was standing by the espresso machine, her back to him, her posture radiating a carefully curated sorrow. But I can't live like this anymore. The mood swings, the paranoia. It's not safe for Leo. Mark looked at the envelope. He didn't open it. He knew what was inside. Vance had warned him it was coming. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Motion for exclusive possession of the marital residence. "You're kicking me out," Mark said. His voice was flat, devoid of the difficulty she was banking on. "I'm asking for space," she corrected, turning around. She looked tired, artfully so. "My lawyer thinks it's best if you stay at the hotel until the hearing, for Leo's sake." For Leo's sake. The phrase twisted in Mark's gut, but he kept his face impassive. This was the trap. If he shouted, if he tore the papers up, if he refused to leave, he was the abusive husband she described in the petition. "Okay," Mark said. Julianne blinked. The script in her head clearly called for resistance. "Okay? If that's what you think is best," Mark said, picking up the envelope. "I'll pack a bag. I'll stay at the peninsula." He saw a flicker of unease in her eyes. It was the first crack in her confidence. She had prepared for a war of noise, not a surrender of silence. 3 days later, Mark sat in the conference room of Rosen and Klein. The table was mahogany, long enough to land a plane on. Arthur Rosen, a man who looked more like a weary bulldog than a lawyer, sat opposite him, reviewing the file Vance had compiled. "She's comfortable," Rosen said, tapping a pen against the stack of papers. "She's filed an affidavit stating that on the night of December 12th, you were intoxicated and belligerent, causing her to fear for her safety. She's locking herself into the lie." "She thinks I have nothing," Mark said, staring at the Chicago skyline through the window. It was snowing again. "She thinks I'm just a husband who got drunk and lost his temper." "Good," Rosen said. "We want her comfortable. Tomorrow is the deposition. We are going to let her tell her story. We are going to let her paint the picture. And then—" Rosen pulled a flash drive from his pocket and set it on the table. "We play the tape." "I want full custody," Mark said, his gaze shifting from the window to the lawyer. "I don't care about the house. I don't care about the money. I want Leo." "If this tape is what you say it is," Rosen said grimly, "and if we catch her lying about the events of that night under oath, the court won't just give you custody. They'll likely grant a restraining order against her." The morning of the deposition was steel gray and bitter cold. Mark adjusted his tie in the mirror of the hotel bathroom. He looked thinner than he had a month ago, but the softness around his jaw was gone. He looked like a man who had survived a fever. He arrived at the law firm 15 minutes early. The conference room was already prepped. A court reporter sat at the head of the table, her fingers poised over her stenotype machine. A video camera was set up on a tripod, the red light blinking. A silent, unblinking eye. At 10:00 a.m. sharp, the door opened. Julianne walked in. She was dressed in navy blue, a color that suggested modesty and authority. She was flanked by her lawyer, a sharp-featured woman named Ms. Halloway, and Lucas Sterling. Mark felt his blood freeze, then boil. Lucas wasn't supposed to be here. "Mr. Sterling is here for moral support," Ms. Halloway announced breezily, noting Mark's stare. "And as a potential character witness regarding Mr. Caldwell's behavior at the gala." It was a power move. Julianne was bringing her lover, the man who had screamed in Mark's hallway, into the very room where she planned to bury Mark. She offered Mark a small, tight smile as she sat down across from him. It was a smile of absolute victory. "Ready when you are," Julianne said softly. Mark sat down. He placed his hands on the table, clasping them together to stop the tremor of rage. He looked at Lucas, who smirked and opened a notebook. "Let's begin," Rosen said, his voice deceptively mild. The camera focused. The court reporter nodded. "Please state your name for the record," Rosen said. "Julianne Caldwell." "And you are the petitioner in this matter?" "Yes." Mark watched her. She looked perfect. She looked credible. She had no idea that the man sitting across from her was no longer her husband, but her executioner. The red light of the video camera didn't blink. It burned. For 45 minutes, Julianne Caldwell wove a tapestry of victimhood so intricate, so convincing, that Mark found himself almost admiring the craftsmanship. She didn't paint him as a monster. That would be too clumsy. She painted him as a tragedy, a man crumbling under pressure, drinking too much, prone to episodes of rage that terrified her and their son. And on the night of December 12th, Ms. Halloway, her lawyer, prompted gently, "What happened after you returned home from the gala?" Julianne took a sip of water. Her hand trembled slightly, a perfect, practiced tremor. "I went straight to bed. I was exhausted. I hoped Mark would stay at the hotel to cool off, but—" She paused, looking down at the table. "I woke up around midnight. There was screaming downstairs, shouting, things being thrown." "Did you recognize the voice?" "It was Mark," she whispered, looking directly into the camera lens. "He was screaming about how I was ungrateful, how I was difficult. It was the same things he said at the party, just violent." Mark felt a muscle in his jaw jump. Across the table, Lucas Sterling shifted in his chair, crossing his legs. He wasn't looking at Julianne. He was looking at his cuticles, bored, waiting for the inevitable victory lap. "Did you see him?" Rosen asked. It was his turn now. His voice was dry, bored. "I didn't dare go downstairs," Julianne said, her eyes wide. "I locked the bedroom door. I was terrified he would come up." "So to be clear," Rosen said, flipping a page in his notebook, "you state under oath that my client, Mark Caldwell, was in the house at approximately 12:00 a.m. screaming at you?" "Yes." "And was anyone else present in the home?" "No, just me, Mark, and our son, Leo." "No guests? No colleagues? No visitors?" Julianne frowned, a flicker of genuine confusion crossing her face. "No, of course not. It was midnight." Rosen nodded slowly. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out his tablet. He placed it in the center of the table, turning the volume up to maximum. "Mrs. Caldwell," Rosen said, "we obtained a digital forensic log from your son's iPad. It seems Leo was awake during this episode. He was playing a game that records background noise when triggered by loud decibels." Lucas Sterling stopped looking at his cuticles. His head snapped up. "This recording is time-stamped at 12:01:14 a.m., Rosen continued. "Let's listen." He pressed play. The silence of the conference room was shattered by the tinny digital reproduction of a man's voice. "You selfish betch. You think you can just walk away?" Julianne's face drained of color. It wasn't a gradual fade. It was instantaneous, as if the blood had been siphoned from her body. She stared at the tablet, her mouth parting slightly. Then came the sound of shattering glass, and then the voice again, mocking, theatrical, breathless. "Was that loud enough for the cheap seats upstairs?" And then Julianne's voice, clear, composed, cold. "Perfect. Now get out. He's calling." Rosen stopped the recording. The silence that followed was heavier than the screaming had been. It was a vacuum, sucking the air out of the room. Mark looked at Lucas. The arrogance was gone. Lucas looked sick. He was staring at the tablet as if it were a bomb that had just detonated in his lap. Mrs. Caldwell, Rosen said, his voice dropping an octave, losing all its previous warmth. That is your voice, is it not? Julianne stammered. She looked at her lawyer, panic flaring in her eyes. That's manipulated. That's a deep fake. We have the metadata, Rosen said ruthlessly. And we have a voice analysis expert who is prepared to testify that the male voice on this recording is a 99.8% match to Mr. Lucas Sterling. Every head in the room turned to Lucas. Me? Lucas squeaked. He stood up, his chair scraping violently against the floor. I wasn't there. This is insane. I'm leaving. Sit down, Mr. Sterling, Rosen barked. It was a command, not a request. Unless you want to be subpoenaed as a co-conspirator in a fraud case, I suggest you sit down. Lucas sat. He looked at Julianne with pure, unadulterated hatred. Julianne wasn't looking at Lucas. She was looking at Mark. Her eyes were searching his face, looking for the husband who used to forgive her, the man who used to smooth things over. She was looking for the difficult man she had invented, hoping he would save her from the quiet, dangerous stranger sitting in his chair. Mark, she whispered. Mark didn't blink. You're right, Julianne, he said softly. I can be difficult. The brownstone in the Gold Coast was listed for sale on a Monday. By Wednesday, Mark and Leo were gone. They didn't take much. The furniture, the heavy draperies, the crystal collection that Julianne had curated with obsessive precision, it all stayed behind. Mark wanted to leave the stage exactly as the actors had left it. He packed only clothes, books, and Leo's electronics. The new apartment in Lincoln Park was smaller. It was a second-floor walk-up with creaky hardwood floors and a view of a snowy alleyway, not the lake. But the radiator hissed with a comforting, steady warmth, and the light that flooded the kitchen was unfiltered by designer blinds. It was 7 a.m. Mark stood at the stove, flipping pancakes. The batter was from a box, and the pan was a cheap non-stick he had bought at Target the night before. He heard footsteps behind him, not the hesitant, shuffling steps of a terrified child, but the heavy, sleepy thud of a growing boy. Smells good, Leo said, climbing onto a bar stool. Mark turned. Leo was wearing mismatched pajamas, and his hair was a bird's nest of static. He looked tired. The divorce was messy, and Julianne was not going quietly. But he didn't look haunted. The shadows under his eyes were fading. Blueberry, Mark said, sliding a plate across the counter. I think I burned the edges a little. I like the crunch, Leo said, picking up a fork. They ate in silence. For years, silence in the Caldwell house had been a weapon, a way to withhold affection, a prelude to an explosion, or a cover for secrets. But this silence was different. It was empty. It was the absence of tension. It was just two people eating breakfast in a room where nothing was hidden. Julianne was staying at a hotel downtown. The deposition had shattered her legal strategy. Once the fraud was exposed, the prenup's infidelity and abuse clauses had clamped down like a steel trap. There would be no alimony. Custody was temporarily granted to Mark, pending a psychological evaluation for Julianne. She had called Mark once, not to apologize, but to scream that he had ruined her reputation and that he was vindictive. Difficult. Mark drank his coffee. He supposed he was. He had been difficult to manipulate, difficult to break, and difficult to lie to. If that was the label she wanted to pin on him as she walked out of his life, he would wear it. Dad? Mark looked up. Leo had stopped eating. He was tracing the grain of the wood on the counter with his thumb. Yeah, bud? Is she coming back? The question hung in the air, fragile as glass. Mark set his mug down. He didn't want to lie. He didn't want to soften the blow with false hope or diplomatic answers. They were done with performances. No, Mark said firmly. She isn't coming back here. This is our place. Just us. Leo nodded slowly. He didn't look sad. He looked relieved. He took another bite of his pancake, chewing thoughtfully. Okay, Leo said. That's good. Mark watched him. The boy was resilient, but the scar would be there. It would take time. There would be therapy, and awkward weekends, and questions that had no easy answers. But the monster in the hallway was gone. The screaming was gone. Mark looked at the microwave clock. 7:15 a.m.? The sun was fully up now, reflecting off the snow on the fire escape, filling the small, messy kitchen with a blinding white light. It was a cold morning in Chicago, bitter and sharp, but inside the air was breathable. Mark reached across the counter and ruffled his son's hair. Finish up. We have boxes to unpack. Can we get a dog? Leo asked, dodging his hand with a grin. Since we don't have the white rugs anymore? Mark smiled, a real smile, one that reached his eyes, one that didn't need to be forced for a camera or a gala. Yeah, Mark said. I think we can handle a dog. He turned back to the stove to pour the rest of the coffee. The nightmare was over. The silence was just silence. And for the first time in a long time, Mark Caldwell wasn't waiting for the phone to ring.